Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm getting started on a new medieval project that I've been excited about for a while, a Burgundian gown. This v-neck dress was the fashion for the upper classes throughout Europe from about 1430 to 1490, paired with, of course, a hennin, or an escoffion, or a butterfly headdress, or whatever this is. It's editing Lydia, and I'm just chiming in to say I'm sorry about whatever is happening here. I guess I've dropped my phone one too many times. Real camera coming soon. Lav mic coming soon. But for now, maybe just don't look too closely at this picture quality. Today I'm just going to give a general overview of the Burgundian gown style and talk about how I went about figuring out how to design a dress that does not exist anymore. The actual sewing will commence in part 2. So I had no idea what a Burgundian was when I started researching for this project, but I read all of the relevant Wikipedia articles so that you don't have to. The original Burgundians were a Germanic tribe hanging out in what is now Western Germany in the 5th century. Germanic tribe, by the way, is a concept that originates with our Roman historical sources. What we know about these groups usually comes from Romans complaining about the peoples on and outside of the frontiers of the empire. It just means assorted northerners. Now it gets rationalized to mean non-Roman tribes that spoke the Germanic languages, but classifying a whole bunch of different people as Germanic is definitely a thing of Roman origin. So anyways, the Burgundians were causing the Roman Empire a bit of grief on the frontier, so they were resettled to the Western Alps, where they established the Kingdom of Burgundy. This lasted past the fall of the Western Roman Empire and was later absorbed into the Frankish Empire. The Burgundians as a cultural group more or less dissolved, but the region got the name Burgundy. At some point, the Frankish Empire got split up and divvied out to various heirs in a somewhat arbitrary fashion, with a chunk of Burgundy falling under control of West Francia. West Francia eventually became the Kingdom of France, and this chunk of Burgundy became the Duchy of Burgundy, which was not really a part of France technically, but it was more or less aligned with French rule. This is the region vaguely geographically the same as the modern Burgundy region in France, and it's the Burgundy we're concerned with today. Sort of. In the 14th century, a Duke of Burgundy married a lady from Flanders and got a bunch of land up there. And England and France were at war for a really long time, so they were really broke. More people married their cousins, Burgundy flip-flopped in the French-English War, and they spent most of their money, rather than on war, buying up territories, and then Joan of Arc did something, and Lydia, you say, this is really convoluted and boring, and I don't care. Correct. I don't care either. What's important to know is that, for about a century, there was a dynasty of dukes from the French Valois family that ruled both Burgundy and the Netherlands. This collection of territories is referred to as Valois-Burgundy. They were expansionist, buying up and marrying their way into more and more property. They were interested in trade, and they really enjoyed having their court close to trade metropoles, and they were patrons of the arts, whose court was glamorous and set the fashions of the time, including the fashion to be a patron of the arts. Burgundy was an emerging power that burned bright at a time when England and France were both exhausted from a century of war and plague. I remember being a kid and flipping through art history textbooks, and the medieval section was like 379 flat and boring Madonna with Childs, and then I got to Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, and that just felt so much more familiar to me. It's rich and naturalistic and human and really detailed, and I was always like, wait, what happened here? Valois-Burgundy is what happened. The Burgundian court was pumping money into the art, the court was in close proximity to maritime trading hubs, merchants were near artists, cosmopolitan rich people started commissioning a lot of art, and the Northern Renaissance happened. By 1500, the dynasty had melted away through marriage, and ownership of territories got shifted around between different noble families. Burgundy dissolved. Europe was now well on its way into the age of nation state, empire building, colonial, whatever that we now call the early modern period. So Burgundy was this sort of in-betweeny thingy that wasn't very medieval, but it existed in the medieval period. That makes it really stand out. There is a lot of light in my face. This was supposed to be a prop. In the Middle Ages, every step of cloth manufacture was extremely labor-intensive, so naturally luxury cloth became the go-to flex and was a huge driver of global trade. In the early 1400s, a big old robe called a houppelande was ubiquitous among the wealthy. It was made of the finest woolen broadcloth and lined in very expensive furs like ermine and squirrel. In addition to being a form of conspicuous consumption, these huge expensive gowns were also a way to store and pass on wealth. Gowns commonly show up in medieval wills, and that might seem odd until you learn that the cost of just the broadcloth needed to make one of these was the equivalent of about 3 to 6 months' wages of a master craftsman at the time. Not some peasant, a master craftsman. Of course, you can't really compare wages then to wages now, and the price of things now to the price of things then, but I think it's fair to say it's less like a dress and more like a fancy car that you can wear. The construction of these gowns seems very simple and loose. There's a turned back collar to display the expensive fur lining, an extra long hem that needed to be pinned or held up in order to move, because not being able to move was like a symbol of status. A belt of ornate woven silk to keep the whole thing in place and to give the appropriate high-waisted, permanently maybe pregnant silhouette that was the ideal of the time. A lighter weight dress worn underneath would peek out at the chest, or a separate placket could be added, and that was a great place to display even fancier fabric like wool scarlet. Perhaps it was the relative uniformity of these gowns that inspired what I call the golden age of ridiculous headwear. Horned headdresses, the escoffion, and of course the iconic princess hat or steeple hennin, and truncated hennins, and all manner of this, that, and the other. Back to the Burgundian gowns. The gowns themselves followed mostly the same formula for about 50 years, though they did get slimmer and more tailored as the century went on, eventually transitioning into something that looks a bit more Tudor to us. At least that's what happened in France and England. What happened in Germany and Italy was kind of like a different story. The Burgundian gown that I plan on making falls somewhere in this transition. It's inspired by the English styles of the 1480s, which survive mostly through small brass monuments embedded in the floors and walls of churches. These are basically like in memory of nameplates on park benches, but with little images of the deceased as well. They were usually made while these people were still alive, and they really show how they wanted to be seen in death, which is in a Burgundian gown and with a stupid big hennin coming off the back of their head with wires coming out of it and a veil on top. I like that it's a cool look, I like that it's a regional take on a Burgundian dress, and I like the mystery of it. There are a few manuscripts from England with miniature illustrations of ladies in these dresses, but mostly it only shows up in the brasses. There's just nothing that exists like the stunningly detailed paintings of the Burgundian Netherlands, partly because England was a bit of a cultural backwater at the time, but mostly because England actually decided to destroy all of their artwork. What that means for me is that there's just enough information to get a taste of how this should look, but not nearly enough to know things like where the seams are or how to place the wires on my hennin, and that just makes it an enticing puzzle, and I want to figure it out. Since the brasses are lacking in details that might tell me how to make the gown, I'm going to start with the mid-century quintessential Burgundian version, of which there are many, many, many images, and then I'll adapt that to make it look more like this. Or I might keep it kind of like this if I have enough fabric, because that style does get paired with the hennins, and the hennins are the part that I like, but we'll have to figure it out. There are 0 actual physical Burgundian gowns left in existence. There's this one later transitional deal in the Museum of Hungary, but it's a Burgundian gown in the way that this is a motorcycle jacket. and it's not going to tell me that much about the construction of something like this. The late medieval period is also still long before things like tailoring manuals start showing up, so all I have to go on is the art as well as economic and legal records. Since cloth was such a huge driver of the economy, it was regulated quite a lot, which means I know exactly how big a piece of broadcloth is supposed to be. At 1.75 yards, it was much wider than standard fabrics, and it stands to reason that if a gown is usually made out of broadcloth, it's probably usually constructed differently from a standard gown. So I'm going to use that as the starting point of my design. Basically, it's a trained gored skirt pattern like you might see in an 1860s skirt, but it's the whole gown, and then there's just sleeves, and then it gets belted in the center, and the front gets pulled open. The V in the front will be formed by a slit in the middle that's folded back on either side to expose the lining, and sort of pulled to expose the shoulders too, and pulling this out here will provide more fullness in the front, and that's something that shows up in a lot of images, is they have a lot of fullness in the front and the back, but not that much fullness on the sides. I think it'll be as big and loose as my material allows, and then all of the fitting will happen through pleats that are stitched in and maybe reinforced with a bit of buckram or something else stiff to keep its shape. And this is something that does happen in paintings of the time. There's sort of these natural looking foldy pleat things, but even when the belt isn't there, they still exist, which indicates that they were stitched in. And then of course there's the jewelry and the belt and something else. So join me next time in a couple of days when I'll make this hennin, and until then, check out all of the other sweet videos that are part of Costume Symposium 2021.